My parents laughed in my face when I asked for help with college, then admitted they'd been using my rent payments to fund my brother's tuition instead. When I finally asked why I was always treated differently, my dad shrugged and said, "We just liked Dylan more. You didn't need us." I didn't say a word. That was 2 months ago. This morning, he watched Dylan pack his bags without offering to help. My folks have always shown clear favoritism toward my little brother Dylan and never tried to hide which son they actually gave a damn about. I had to bust my butt at a grocery store to save up for my hit-up Honda, while Dylan got handed a brand new Mazda for his 14th birthday just because. Same story with everything else, like gaming consoles and smartphones and designer clothes where I got hand-me-downs or nothing. They always told me to man up and stop whining and be the supportive big brother who celebrates his siblings' wins. Now I'm 18, taking a year off before starting at the local community college, so I can work full-time at a warehouse. My parents straight up laughed in my face when I asked if they could chip in for my tuition expenses. But then last week I overheard them in the kitchen discussing how they plan to cover every penny of Dylan's university costs when his time came. I pulled out my phone and hit record while hiding behind the wall, then walked in asking why Dylan gets his education paid for, but I don't. They had no clue I was filming when they said Dylan just needs more support than I do. I pressed them, asking how that made any sense when neither of us had scholarships or anything special going on. Then I kept pushing with more questions about why this double standard had always existed in our house. They got mad, and my old man said maybe it was time for me to find my own place since they were tired of providing shelter for an ungrateful kid. I reminded him that I fork over more than half the mortgage payment every month, but they brushed that off. I stormed out and in my anger posted the whole recording on TikTok and Facebook with a long rant about how this treatment had been my whole life. Within hours, my parents were banging on my bedroom door with my dad screaming about how I'd humiliated them online for everyone to see. We had another blowout fight before they stomped away, furious. My grandma called me that evening saying she was disgusted by what she saw, then showed up the next morning with basically the entire extended family. They forced my parents to sit on the living room sofa like scolded children, while relatives took turns telling them off. That's when I learned my grandparents had been sending them cash every month for years to help with household bills. Dylan stood there looking lost and confused before eventually taking the family's side and admitting he'd noticed the unfair treatment too. My parents gave me this obviously fake apology through gritted teeth. My grandparents offered to let me move in with them immediately and said they'd stop all financial support to my parents. My dad told me I should have kept family business private and hasn't spoken to me since, while my mom has been bawling non-stop. Now I'm second-guessing whether I took things too far by going public. Update. I called my grandparents yesterday and told them I'd take them up on their offer to move in with them. While we talked, I asked about those monthly payments they'd been making to my parents all these years. Apparently my mom had quit her office job to stay home full-time, and they started struggling financially. My grandparents stepped in, sending money each month to help with the mortgage plus extra that was supposed to go into college savings accounts for both Dylan and me equally. But my parents only ever planned to use those funds for Dylan's education, which is also how they bought him that car. So my grandparents are cutting them off completely now, which means my mom will probably have to go back to work to help dad make ends meet. I confronted my parents, demanding to know why Dylan was always the golden child, and asked if there was some big secret I should know about. The answer was absolutely nothing at all, not a damn thing. I'm not the product of an affair, or even an accident baby, they just plain liked Dylan better. I was furious, and we screamed at each other until I couldn't take it anymore, and left. My grandparents pulled up Saturday morning with a U-Haul truck ready to help me move. My parents were shocked when we started carrying boxes inside to pack up my stuff. Dad tried blocking our path, so I reminded him how he told me to get out, and that's exactly what I was doing. Mom started crying again, saying Dad only said that because he was mad, and they were actually counting on my rent payments for Dylan's college fund. I asked if that meant Dylan would never have to pay rent when he turned 18 like I did. Dad admitted that since I was working instead of going straight to college, my money should help pay for my brother's education. Basically, they never expected Dylan to work a single day while in school. My grandpa lost it and tore into my father, saying he'd raised him better than this garbage. He said he'd never been more ashamed, and they wouldn't see another dime from him ever again. Then he warned them he'd cut them out of the family completely if they tried any revenge against me for exposing their lies. Dad backed down immediately, and neither parent said another word to me after that. Dylan and I had this awkward goodbye moment where we didn't really know what to say to each other. Then I just loaded up my car and waved as I drove away to start fresh. But right as I was settling into my new room at my grandparents' place, Dylan texted me a screenshot of our parents' joint bank account showing they'd been hiding a secret trust fund worth over $200,000 that was supposed to be split between us. I stared at that screenshot for what felt like hours, my hands shaking as I zoomed in to make sure I was reading those numbers right. $200,000 sitting in an account with both our names on it, and they'd never said a word. I immediately called Dylan back, and he picked up on the first ring. He explained how he'd been snooping through Dad's home office looking for his car insurance papers when he stumbled across bank statements stuffed in the back of a filing cabinet. The account had been opened when I was born, with regular deposits from various family members over the years for birthdays, holidays, and special occasions. The most recent statement showed it had been sitting untouched for at least 5 years. I hung up and marched straight to my grandparents, who were watching TV in their living room. When I showed them the screenshot, my grandma's face went white. She grabbed the remote and muted the television, then called my grandpa over from the kitchen. They exchanged this long look before my grandpa finally spoke up. Turns out they'd been contributing to that account since day one, thinking it would give both Dylan and me a solid start in life. Other relatives had pitched in too, believing the money would be split fairly when we each turned 18. My grandparents had specifically instructed my parents to use it for our education or to help us buy our first homes. My grandma got up and disappeared into their bedroom, returning with a thick folder full of receipts and bank records. She'd kept track of every single deposit they'd made over the years, and the numbers were staggering. Between them and other family members, they'd contributed over half of what was in that account. I asked why they never mentioned it before, and my grandpa admitted they'd assumed my parents had already given me my share when I turned 18. They thought maybe I'd blown through it or made bad investments, which is why they never brought it up. Finding out the truth made them angrier than I'd ever seen them. My grandma immediately started making phone calls to other relatives who'd contributed, putting them on speaker so I could hear their reactions. My great aunt screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. My uncle threatened to drive over and handle things himself. Every single person felt betrayed and demanded answers. While my grandma worked through her contact list, my grandpa pulled me aside and asked if I wanted to pursue legal action. He said what my parents did was theft, plain and simple, and we had enough evidence to take them to court. But I hesitated, thinking about how that would affect Dylan and tear our family apart even more. Instead, I decided to give my parents one chance to make things right. I texted them saying I knew about the trust fund, and they had 24 hours to transfer my half, or I'd let every family member know exactly what they'd done. Then I turned off my phone and tried to get some sleep, though I mostly just stared at the ceiling. The next morning, I woke up to 57 missed calls and twice as many texts. Most were from my parents, but Dylan had been trying to reach me too. When I finally called him back, he said our parents had been up all night fighting about what to do. Mom wanted to transfer the money immediately, but Dad kept insisting they needed it for Dylan's education. Dylan surprised me by saying he didn't want money that was stolen from me. He'd already told our parents he'd rather take out student loans than use funds that should have been mine. That hit me hard because despite everything, Dylan was still my little brother, and hearing him stand up for me meant more than I expected. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a notification from my banking app. I held my breath as I opened it, then nearly dropped my phone when I saw the deposit. $100,000, exactly half of the trust fund, sitting in my account. A text from my mom followed immediately, begging me not to tell the rest of the family, but I'd already made up my mind. I screenshot the deposit and sent it to our family group chat, along with a message explaining everything. I made it clear that while they'd finally given me my share, it only happened because they got caught. The responses came flooding in within minutes, and none of them were pretty. My grandparents decided to host an emergency family meeting that evening. They specifically uninvited my parents, but made sure Dylan could come if he wanted. He showed up looking exhausted, and we sat together on the couch while relatives filled my grandparents' living room. The meeting was intense. Family members shared story after story about money they'd given my parents over the years, thinking it was for both kids. My great-uncle revealed he'd paid for what he thought were family vacations, only to learn I'd been left with neighbors while my parents took Dylan to Disney World. My aunt mentioned birthday checks that never made it to me. Dylan looked sick as he heard all this. He turned to me at one point and whispered that he had no idea, and I believed him. He was just a kid who got showered with gifts and attention. How was he supposed to know it came at my expense? My grandpa stood up and made an announcement that shocked everyone. He said he'd already contacted his lawyer about removing my parents from his will entirely. Everything would now be split between Dylan and me, skipping our parents completely. Other relatives started nodding and saying they'd do the same. After the meeting, Dylan asked if we could talk privately. We went out to my grandparents' back porch, and he broke down crying. He apologized over and over, saying he wished he'd noticed sooner and done something about it. I told him it wasn't his fault, and I meant it. He then dropped another bombshell. He said he'd been going through more of our parents' files and found emails between them discussing their plan. Apparently, they'd decided years ago that I was too independent and would be fine on my own, while Dylan needed more support. They'd convinced themselves they were doing the right thing by investing everything in him. I asked Dylan what he planned to do now, and he said he wasn't sure. He didn't want to live with our parents anymore, but wasn't 18 yet. My grandparents must have been listening because they came outside and offered to let him move in too. They had plenty of room and would make sure he finished high school properly. The next few days were a whirlwind. Dylan moved his stuff in while our parents watched from the doorway, not saying a word. Dad looked defeated while Mom just cried. Neither of them tried to stop him or apologize again. They knew they'd lost both their sons and their entire extended family's support. My grandparents helped me figure out what to do with the money. We opened investment accounts and met with financial advisors to make sure I'd be set for college and beyond. It felt surreal having that kind of security after years of scraping by. Dylan and I started building a real relationship for the first time. Without our parents' toxic influence, we could just be brothers. We played video games, went to movies, and had actual conversations about our lives. He told me about the pressure he'd felt being the golden child, always worried about disappointing them. Word got around our hometown about what happened. People who'd known our family for years started reaching out with their own stories about witnessing the favoritism. My old boss from the grocery store called to say he'd always wondered why my parents never came to my work events while showing up for every single one of Dylan's activities. The situation with our parents reached a breaking point when they showed up at my grandparents' house demanding to see us. My grandpa met them at the door and told them they weren't welcome. Dad tried to push past him, but my grandpa stood firm. That's when my dad said something that explained everything. He admitted that when I was born, he wasn't ready to be a father. He'd been 22, working construction, and felt trapped. By the time Dylan came along 4 years later, he'd settled into family life and was excited about having a kid. So Dylan got the father he'd always wanted to be, while I got the resentful version who saw me as the reason his youth ended. Mom didn't have any excuse, except that she'd followed Dad's lead. She'd seen how he treated us differently, and instead of standing up for me, she'd joined in. She said she regretted it now, but the damage was done. My grandpa told them to leave and not come back until they'd gotten therapy and made real changes. That night, I couldn't sleep. Everything finally made sense, but it didn't make it hurt less. Dylan found me sitting on the back porch at 3 in the morning and joined me. We didn't talk, just sat there looking at the stars, finally free from the toxic household we'd grown up in. My grandparents enrolled Dylan in a better school closer to their house. I started taking community college classes while working part-time instead of full-time. With my share of the trust fund, I didn't need to unalive myself at the warehouse anymore. I could actually focus on my education and future. The family group chat became our new way of staying connected. Relatives who'd been distant before started reaching out more, making sure Dylan and I knew we were loved and supported. My great-aunt even offered to pay for therapy for both of us, saying we'd need help processing everything. I took her up on that offer. My first therapy session was rough, but it helped to talk to someone neutral about everything. The therapist helped me understand that my parents' favoritism wasn't my fault and that I deserved better. Dylan started seeing someone too, dealing with his own guilt and confusion. As the weeks passed, life settled into a new normal. My grandparents were amazing, treating us both equally and making sure we had everything we needed. They never badmouthed our parents, but didn't make excuses for them either. They just focused on giving us the stable, loving home we should have had all along. The routine at my grandparents' house had just started feeling normal when everything changed. 3 weeks after Dylan moved in, I came home from my warehouse shift to find my car vandalized in the driveway. Someone had keyed deep scratches along both sides, spelling out "ungrateful" in jagged letters. My grandpa filed a police report while my grandma comforted me, but we all knew who was responsible even without proof. Dylan emerged from his room looking pale, clutching his phone. He showed me a string of messages from Dad demanding he come home immediately or face consequences. The texts grew increasingly aggressive, threatening to cancel his phone plan, report the car as stolen, and even call Child Protective Services to force him back. My grandparents immediately contacted their lawyer to ensure they had temporary guardianship paperwork in order. The harassment escalated quickly. My supervisor at the warehouse pulled me aside the next day, explaining that someone had called claiming to be a former employer, warning about my supposed theft and dishonesty. Fortunately, he knew me well enough to dismiss it, but the attempt to sabotage my job made my blood boil. Dylan faced similar attacks at school when anonymous emails circulated among parents, claiming he was a troubled teen who'd run away from home. My grandparents installed security cameras after we noticed someone had been in their backyard overnight, leaving cigarette butts near the shed. The footage revealed Dad sneaking around at 2 a.m., though he'd been careful to avoid doing anything we could report. My grandpa changed all the locks and added motion sensor lights, turning their peaceful home into a fortress. Things took a darker turn when I received a letter from the community college stating my enrollment had been canceled due to outstanding debts from a loan I'd never taken out. After hours on the phone, I discovered someone had applied for student loans in my name months ago, maxing out my eligibility. The financial aid office couldn't help until I sorted out the fraud, which meant hiring a lawyer and potentially delaying my education by another semester. Dylan broke down when his beloved guitar disappeared from his room while we were all out. It had been a gift from our parents years ago, one of the few possessions he truly treasured. We found it later that week listed on Craigslist with photos clearly taken in our parents' garage. When confronted by my grandpa, Dad claimed Dylan had given them permission to sell it since they'd paid for it originally. The psychological warfare intensified when Mom started showing up at Dylan's school during lunch, standing just outside the fence where she could watch him, but technically wasn't trespassing. She'd hold signs saying, "I love you," and "come home," while crying dramatically. Other students started filming her breakdowns, and Dylan became the subject of gossip and ridicule. My workplace drama continued when expensive equipment went missing during my shift. Security footage mysteriously corrupted right during the time frame when the theft occurred. My supervisor had no choice but to suspend me pending investigation, even though he believed believed I was innocent. Without that income, I had to dip into the trust fund money I'd been saving for college. Dylan discovered our parents had been contacting his teachers, spinning tales about mental health issues, and claiming he'd been manipulated by me into leaving home. Some teachers started treating him differently, watching him with suspicion and questioning his every move. His grades began slipping from the stress, giving our parents ammunition to argue he needed their supervision. The situation exploded when Child Protective Services showed up at my grandparents' door. Our parents had filed a report claiming elderly abuse and neglect, alleging that Dylan and I were taking advantage of vulnerable seniors. The social worker quickly realized the claims were baseless, but the investigation process meant multiple visits, interviews, and paperwork that exhausted my grandparents. During one particularly bad week, I woke up to find my bank account frozen. The bank claimed suspicious activity and needed verification that could take days to resolve. Without access to my money, I couldn't help with groceries or gas, making me feel like a burden despite my grandparents' reassurances. Dylan's debit card stopped working the same day, leaving us both financially crippled. My grandma's health started suffering from the constant stress. She developed migraines and high blood pressure, requiring medication and frequent doctor visits. Watching her deteriorate because of our parents' actions filled me with rage. Dylan blamed himself, offering to return home if it would make the harassment stop, but my grandparents wouldn't hear of it. The legal bills mounted as we fought the false student loan, dealt with CPS investigations, and pursued restraining orders. My grandparents' retirement savings took a hit, though they never complained. The lawyer warned us that without concrete proof of harassment, getting protection would be difficult. Our parents had been careful to stay just within legal boundaries. Everything came to a head when I returned from a job interview to find our parents in my grandparents' living room. They'd convinced a locksmith they were locked out of their elderly parents' home and needed emergency access. My grandma was trembling in her chair, while my grandpa stood protectively beside her. Our parents were rifling through drawers, claiming they were looking for their important documents. I immediately called the police while Dylan filmed everything on his phone. Dad grabbed for the phone, causing Dylan to stumble backward into a bookshelf. Mom shrieked that we were assaulting them, playing victim for the arriving officers. The scene was chaos, with everyone talking over each other and accusations flying. The police separated us for questioning. Our parents spun a tale about concerned parents trying to retrieve personal property from a home they'd lived in during hard times. They claimed my grandparents were being manipulated by us and weren't thinking clearly. The officers seemed skeptical, but said it was a civil matter without clear criminal activity. After the police left, we discovered the real reason for their break-in. Several financial documents were missing, including records of the trust fund deposits and my grandparents' will. Dad had also taken Dylan's birth certificate and social security card, documents needed for school enrollment. The violation of our safe space left everyone shaken. My job interview that day had gone well until the manager received a call during our meeting. His expression changed as he listened. Then he apologetically informed me they'd received concerning information about my character and couldn't proceed with hiring. Another opportunity destroyed by our parents' interference. Dylan's breaking point came when his best friend stopped talking to him. The friend's parents had received anonymous messages warning them about Dylan's dangerous family situation and forbidding contact. Years of friendship ended because our parents couldn't accept losing control. Dylan spent that night sobbing in his room while I felt helpless to comfort him. My grandparents called another family meeting, this time including their lawyer. We needed a coordinated response to the escalating harassment. Relatives shared their own experiences of recent manipulation attempts, including sob story calls, asking for money, and false claims about my grandparents' declining mental state. Our parents had been systematically trying to turn the family against us. The lawyer outlined our options, none of them great. Restraining orders required proof of threats or violence. The identity theft case could take months to resolve. The CPS investigation would continue until formally closed. Meanwhile, our parents remained free to continue their campaign of destruction, always careful to avoid crossing legal lines. I made the difficult decision to withdraw from community college enrollment entirely rather than start late with the financial aid mess. Another semester of my life derailed by their actions. The trust fund money wouldn't last forever, especially with legal fees eating into it. My future felt increasingly uncertain. Dylan's school performance tanked as the harassment continued. Teachers who'd once praised him now viewed him with suspicion. His guidance counselor suggested he might benefit from returning to a stable home environment, clearly influenced by our parents' campaign. We had to fight to keep him enrolled, providing documentation of the temporary guardianship at every turn. The next escalation came through social media. Fake accounts using our names appeared on various platforms, posting inflammatory content and sending inappropriate messages to family members and Dylan's classmates. Despite reporting them, new accounts popped up faster than platforms could remove them. Our reputations suffered as people questioned what was real. I finally found a new job at a different warehouse, only to lose it within a week when my new employer received threatening legal notices about hiring someone under investigation for fraud. The letters were vague enough to avoid libel, but serious enough to spook a small business owner. My parents had effectively made me unemployable in our town. Dylan considered dropping dropping out of school to get his GED instead. The daily humiliation of Mom's lunchtime vigils and the social isolation had become unbearable. My grandparents fought against this, knowing it would derail his college prospects, but we were running out of options to protect him from the psychological torture. The war reached our doorstep again when we woke to find our mailbox destroyed and mail scattered across the lawn. Important letters were missing, including correspondence from lawyers and bills. We started using a post office box, adding another layer of inconvenience to our disrupted lives. Every normal activity became complicated. My grandpa's health declined next. The stress triggered a mild heart episode requiring hospitalization. Watching him in that hospital bed, looking fragile and worn down, I felt the full weight of what our presence had cost them. Dylan and I discussed whether we should leave to protect them, but my grandpa gripped my hand and made me promise we'd stay. The financial manipulation continued when our parents somehow convinced Dylan's auto insurance company that they were the primary policyholders. They canceled his coverage without warning, leaving him unable to drive legally. Getting new insurance required proving ownership of the car, difficult when our parents had kept the title documents during the break-in. I discovered they'd also been calling my references from job applications, posing as potential employers conducting background checks. They'd plant seeds of doubt about my reliability and honesty, ensuring I'd never get positive recommendations. My network of professional contacts, carefully built over years of hard work, crumbled under their assault. The situation with Dylan's school reached crisis point when the principal called a meeting. The accumulated complaints, concerns from teachers, and ongoing disruptions from Mom's presence made Dylan's continued enrollment problematic. They suggested a transfer to a different school district, which would mean a long commute or finding somewhere else to live. My grandparents' neighbors started avoiding us after receiving anonymous letters warning about the dangerous situation next door. People who'd been friendly for decades now crossed the street to avoid conversation. The isolation added another layer of pain to our already difficult situation. Our parents had poisoned every aspect of our lives. During a particularly dark moment, I considered giving up entirely. Maybe if I disappeared, took my trust fund money and started fresh somewhere far away, the harassment would stop. Dylan could return home, my grandparents could have peace, and I could build a life free from this toxicity. But I couldn't abandon my brother or the grandparents who'd sacrificed so much. The next phase involved financial warfare. Our parents filed claims with credit agencies disputing various accounts, causing chaos with our credit reports. They reported the trust fund transfer as fraudulent, triggering investigations that froze portions of the money. Every financial institution treated us with suspicion, making simple transactions complicated ordeals. Dylan's mental health deteriorated visibly. He stopped eating properly, rarely left his room except for school, and jumped at every unexpected noise. The confident kid who'd once stood up to our parents had been systematically broken down. Therapy helped, but couldn't undo the daily damage inflicted by their campaign. I managed to secure cash-only work, doing manual labor for a construction company. The pay was terrible and conditions harsh, but it was income our parents couldn't sabotage. Every dollar went toward household expenses and legal fees. The trust fund money I'd hoped would secure my education instead funded our survival. Our parents' masterstroke came when they filed for emergency custody of Dylan, claiming my grandparents were unfit guardians. The court documents painted a picture of elderly people manipulated by a vindictive older grandson, unable to provide proper supervision for a troubled teen. The legal battle would be expensive and emotionally draining, exactly what they'd intended. My grandma collapsed during dinner one evening, overwhelmed by stress and exhaustion. The ambulance ride to the hospital remains a blur of fear and guilt. As doctors worked to stabilize her, I sat in the waiting room wondering how much more damage our presence would cause. Dylan hadn't spoken a word since we'd arrived, staring blankly at the floor. The custody hearing loomed while my grandma recovered. Our lawyer prepared us for the worst, explaining that courts often favored biological parents unless serious abuse could be proven. Our evidence of harassment looked circumstantial without direct threats or violence. The judge might order Dylan's return home despite everything. I spent sleepless nights preparing for the hearing, gathering every piece of evidence we'd collected. Bank statements showing the stolen trust fund, emails documenting the favoritism, recordings of their admission that they simply liked Dylan better. Would it be enough to convince a judge that returning him would be harmful? Dylan surprised everyone by writing a detailed letter to the court about his experiences. He described years of being the golden child while watching me suffer, the guilt he carried, and his fear of returning to parents who'd shown such cruelty. His English teacher helped him polish it into a powerful statement that brought tears to my eyes. The harassment intensified as the hearing approached. Dead animals appeared on the doorstep, our tires were slashed repeatedly, and threatening messages increased despite the pending court case. Our parents seemed determined to break us before the judge could rule. We installed more cameras and rarely left the house alone. My work situation imploded when immigration officials showed up at the construction site. Anonymous tips had claimed the company hired undocumented workers, triggering a raid that shut down operations. While eventually cleared, the company couldn't afford the disruption and closed permanently. Another job job lost to our parents' vendetta. The night before the custody hearing, none of us slept. My grandparents held each other on the couch while Dylan and I sat at the kitchen table, going over his statement one more time. We'd done everything possible to prepare, but the outcome remained uncertain. Our entire future hinged on a judge's decision about where Dylan belonged. Morning arrived too quickly. We dressed carefully, trying to project stability and responsibility. My grandma insisted on attending despite doctor's orders for rest. As we drove to the courthouse, I caught glimpses of our parents' car following at a distance. The final battle was about to begin, and everything we'd fought for hung in the balance. The courthouse parking lot was packed when we arrived. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I searched for a spot, finally squeezing into a space near the back. Dylan sat beside me, clutching the folder containing his letter while my grandparents waited in the back seat. We walked toward the entrance together, none of us speaking. Inside, the security line stretched down the hallway. My grandpa emptied his pockets while my grandma struggled with her purse, her hands still shaking from the stress. Dylan kept checking his phone, probably hoping for messages from friends who'd abandoned him. The metal detector beeped when I walked through, forgetting about my belt buckle. Our lawyer met us outside the family court waiting area. He reviewed our documents one more time, making sure we had everything organized. The trust fund evidence, the recordings, Dylan's letter, medical records showing my grandparents' stress-related health issues. He warned us again that custody cases favored biological parents, and we needed to stay calm no matter what happened inside. The waiting room was filled with other families in various states of distress. A woman bounced a crying baby while arguing with someone on her phone. Two men sat on opposite sides glaring at each other. Dylan picked at a loose thread on his shirt sleeve, unraveling it further with each pull. Our case number appeared on the electronic board after 40 minutes. My stomach dropped as we stood up, following our lawyer down the narrow hallway. The courtroom door felt heavier than it should have when I pushed it open. My parents were already seated at their table with their attorney, both dressed in their Sunday best. Mom had styled her hair and applied makeup carefully, looking nothing like the woman who'd been crying dramatically outside Dylan's school. Dad wore his only suit, the one from their anniversary dinners. They'd brought photo albums and what looked like report cards, playing the part of concerned parents perfectly. The judge entered, and we all stood. She was younger than I expected, with tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too many family disputes. After reviewing the case summary, she asked both lawyers to present opening statements. Our parents' attorney went first, painting them as loving parents desperate to reunite their family. He claimed my grandparents were elderly and overwhelmed, that I was a bitter older son poisoning Dylan against his parents. The stolen trust fund was explained away as money being saved for both children's futures. The harassment we'd endured was reframed as concerned parents trying to check on their son's welfare. Our lawyer countered with facts. The trust fund transfers that only happened after exposure, the recorded admission of favoritism, the pattern of harassment that had cost me multiple jobs and nearly destroyed Dylan's education. He presented evidence methodically, building our case piece by piece. The judge called my parents to testify first. Mom spoke softly about how much she missed Dylan, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She claimed the favoritism was all a misunderstanding, that she loved both her sons equally. Dad testified about working hard to provide for his family, insisting the trust fund was always meant for both of us. Their lawyer asked leading questions designed to make them seem sympathetic. Had they made mistakes? Of course. What parent hadn't? Were they willing to attend family counseling? Absolutely. Anything to heal their family. The performance was convincing if you didn't know the truth. Cross-examination revealed cracks in their story. Our lawyer asked why Dylan received a car at 14 while I worked to buy my own. Why I paid rent at 18 while they planned for Dylan to live free through college. Why the trust fund transfer only happened after I threatened exposure. Their answers grew defensive and contradictory. My grandparents testified next. My grandpa's voice stayed steady as he described finding out their financial support had been misused. My grandma broke down describing the harassment, the stress that had landed her in the hospital. She pulled out her medication bottles, showing the judge what our parents' campaign had cost her health. The judge asked pointed questions about their ability to care for Dylan. Could they handle a teenager's needs at their age? My grandpa explained their support system, the family members who helped, the stable home they provided. My grandma talked about enrolling Dylan in a better school, getting him therapy, treating both of us equally. I was called to testify about the harassment. I described losing jobs, having my education derailed, watching Dylan suffer at school. The judge asked why I hadn't reported some incidents to police. I explained how our parents stayed just within legal boundaries, making prosecution impossible. She seemed to understand, but remained expressionless. The court took a recess for lunch. We ate sandwiches from the courthouse cafeteria in silence, nobody having much appetite. Dylan practiced reading his letter again, though he knew it by heart. Our parents sat across the cafeteria with their lawyer, occasionally glancing our way. When court resumed, Dylan was called to testify. His voice shook as he answered basic questions about his living situation. The judge asked if he felt safe with our grandparents, if his needs were being met. He nodded, adding details about having his own room, regular meals, help with homework. Our parents' lawyer tried to shake him during cross-examination. Wasn't he angry about leaving his childhood home? Didn't he miss his parents? Dylan stayed strong, explaining he missed the parents he thought he had, not the ones who'd stolen from his brother and destroyed their family. The judge asked Dylan to read his letter. The courtroom fell silent as he described growing up as the favored child, slowly realizing the cost of that favoritism. He talked about watching me work multiple jobs while he got handed everything, the guilt of benefiting from my suffering, his fear of returning to parents who could be so cruel. His voice cracked when he reached the part about our relationship, how we'd barely known each other growing up because our parents had driven a wedge between us, how living with our grandparents had given us the chance to actually be brothers. He looked directly at our parents when he said he couldn't go back to a home built on lies and manipulation. Mom started crying loudly, but it felt performative after Dylan's genuine emotion. Dad's jaw clenched as he stared at the table. Their lawyer requested a brief recess to confer with his clients, but the judge denied it, saying we needed to proceed. Character witnesses testified next. Dylan's teacher described the disruption caused by Mom's lunchtime vigils. My former supervisor explained the suspicious calls about my character that had forced my suspension. A social worker testified that the elderly abuse allegations against my grandparents were completely unfounded. Our parents' witnesses were less impressive. A neighbor who barely knew us testified they seemed like good parents from what she'd observed. Their pastor admitted he hadn't seen them in months, but spoke about their past church attendance. Nobody could testify to recent positive parenting because there wasn't any. The lawyers made closing arguments as the afternoon wore on. Our parents' attorney pleaded for family reunification, suggesting supervised visits as a compromise. Our lawyer emphasized the pattern of harassment, the financial theft, the admission of favoritism. He argued returning Dylan would cause irreparable harm. The judge announced she would review the evidence and issue her decision within the week. Court was adjourned, and we all stood as she left. The walk back through the courthouse felt longer than the morning arrival. Nobody spoke in the elevator or the parking lot. My parents tried to approach Dylan outside, but our lawyer stepped between them. Dad shouted something about this not being over. Mom wailed about missing her baby. Dylan didn't look back as we walked to the car, though I saw his shoulders shaking. The drive home was quiet, except for the radio playing softly. My grandma reached over to squeeze Dylan's hand. My grandpa stared out the window at passing traffic. I focused on the road, trying not to think about what would happen if the judge ruled against us. That evening, relatives called constantly for updates. My grandma fielded most calls while Dylan and I sat on the back porch. He asked what would happen if he had to go back. I promised we'd figure something out, though I had no idea what that might be. The week of waiting was torture. Dylan barely ate, pushing food around his plate at dinner. I couldn't focus on my community college coursework, reading the same paragraph over and over. My grandparents tried to maintain normal routines, but tension filled every room. Our lawyer called Thursday afternoon. The judge had reached her decision, and we needed to be in court Friday morning. He couldn't tell us the outcome over the phone, but his tone gave nothing away. Another sleepless night followed, all of us pretending to rest while staring at our ceilings. Friday morning came too fast and too slow simultaneously. We dressed carefully again, as if our appearance might somehow influence an already made decision. The drive to court was silent, each of us lost in our own fears about what awaited us. The courtroom was less crowded this time. My parents sat rigidly at their table, their lawyer whispering last-minute advice. We took our seats, and I noticed Mom's hands trembling as she clutched Dad's arm. The bailiff called for order as the judge entered. She began by summarizing the case, acknowledging the complexity of family dynamics. She noted that while parents generally have fundamental rights to their children, those rights weren't absolute when the child's welfare was at stake. My heart pounded as she continued through legal precedents and findings of fact. The judge found that my parents had engaged in a pattern of harassment that disrupted Dylan's education and stability. She cited the false reports to employers, the school disruptions, the property damage. She noted their admission of favoritism and the financial misconduct with the trust fund. Regarding my grandparents' fitness as guardians, she found them fully capable despite their age. She commended their efforts to provide stability, education, and equal treatment. The medical documentation showed their health issues stemmed from my parents' harassment, not inability to provide care. The ruling came swift and clear. Temporary guardianship would remain with my grandparents until Dylan turned 18. My parents would have supervised visitation once monthly, contingent on completing anger management and family therapy. Any further harassment would result in criminal charges and permanent loss of custody rights. Mom collapsed sobbing while Dad slammed his fist on the table. Their lawyer quickly ushered them out as they shouted about appeals and injustice. Dylan sagged with relief beside me, tears streaming down his face. My grandparents held each other, finally able to breathe. Our lawyer explained the next steps. My parents had 30 days to begin therapy if they wanted visitation rights. The restraining orders we'd requested were granted, prohibiting them from coming near our home, schools, or workplaces. Any violation would mean immediate arrest. We left the courthouse differently than we'd entered. Dylan walked taller, no longer hunched with fear. My grandparents moved easier, the weight of uncertainty lifted. I felt something between exhaustion and elation, knowing we'd won, but understanding the cost. The next morning, I woke without the usual dread. My grandma was making pancakes, humming in the kitchen. Dylan actually smiled at breakfast, talking about rejoining the school band now that he could focus. My grandpa read the newspaper without the tension that had lived in his shoulders for months. I returned to my warehouse job the following week, my supervisor welcoming me back warmly. Dylan's grades started improving once the daily disruptions ended. My grandparents' health stabilized without constant stress. We began building the life we should have always had. 2 months later, my parents completed their required therapy and requested their first supervised visit with Dylan. He chose to meet them at the counselor's office, with me waiting in the lobby for support. The visit lasted exactly 1 hour, and Dylan emerged looking drained but not destroyed. He told me they'd apologized, though it felt hollow. They still insisted they'd done what they thought was best, unable to fully acknowledge the harm they'd caused. The counselor recommended continuing visits to work towards some form of relationship, though it would never be what they'd had before. I started community college that fall, finally able to focus on my education. Dylan threw himself into junior year, making new friends who didn't know our family drama. My grandparents celebrated every small victory, from my first A on an exam to Dylan making first chair in band. The trust fund money I'd received went toward tuition and a reliable used car. I worked part-time instead of full-time, balancing school and contributing to household expenses. Dylan got his first job at a bookstore, wanting to earn his own money despite not needing to. My parents maintained their monthly visits with Dylan, slowly building something resembling a relationship. They never contacted me directly, respecting the boundaries I'd established. I heard through Dylan that Mom had returned to work and they'd downsized their house to manage finances. By spring, life had found its rhythm. Dylan and I played video games on weekends, studied together at the kitchen table, and talked about our futures. My grandparents hosted family dinners where relatives gathered to celebrate our successes. The drama that had consumed our lives became just another part of our story. Dylan turned 18 the following year. He chose to stay with our grandparents through high school graduation, though he was free to leave. He'd been accepted to several colleges with partial scholarships, his grades having recovered despite everything. I was halfway through my associate degree, planning to transfer to a 4-year university. Our parents attended Dylan's graduation, sitting separately from our family section. They looked older, worn down by the consequences of their choices. Mom tried to approach me afterward, but I simply walked away. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, and I'd made peace with that. That summer, Dylan and I took a road trip before he left for college. We drove without a real destination, stopping at random attractions and cheap motels. We talked about everything and nothing, finally having the brother relationship we'd been denied for so long. When we returned home, my grandparents had organized a going-away party for Dylan. Family members who'd supported us through the worst times gathered to celebrate new beginnings. My grandpa pulled me aside, telling me how proud he was of the man I'd become despite everything. As Dylan packed for college, he thanked me for fighting for him. I reminded him he'd fought too, standing up to our parents when it mattered most. We'd survived together, and that bond would last regardless of distance or time. The night before Dylan left, we sat on the back porch one last time. The stars were bright, and the air was warm. We didn't need to talk about the past anymore. We'd made it through, and now we both had futures to build. My grandparents joined us, and we sat together as a real family, the kind we'd always deserved to be.